This is an IWP media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent accredited graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. For more information, visit iwp.edu.
Welcome to the IWP podcast. I'm your host, Jim Robbins, Dean of Academics at the Institute for World Politics, coming to you live here right in Washington, D.C. Joining us from Nebraska is John J. Waters, author, editor, novelist, lawyer, veteran, government worker, but not the film director.
Not yet, no.
He is still alive.
Yeah, fantastic director. He's actually from Baltimore, and when I lived in Maryland and went to school at Annapolis, people would frequently say things like, "The director, Pink Flamingos, Crybaby, is that you? Is that you?" And then when I moved back to the Midwest, where I'm from, Nebraska, I seldom heard people reference the very famous John S. Waters,
right?
Maryland, yeah.
Yeah, you guys are so similar, though. I can see you, but
I take that as a compliment, Jim. Thank you.
So, why don't you tell people a little bit about what you're doing these days? And you work for Real Clear and do other things.
Yeah, I'm a lawyer. That's my occupation. Writing, editing has always been my avocation. Something I do in my spare time. It's a hobby, I suppose you'd call it. Though for me, and probably for many people who like to write, who like to read too, it's a lifestyle. Being in the flow of what's happening in current events, reading fiction, reading nonfiction, kind of like it's not just the stories you're after, it's life. You want more of it. You want the illumination of character that only a good story can give you. And some people nowadays find that through television, through film. There's more than ever. For me, it's always been writing. And so I'm seeking in my spare hours, in my spare moments, opportunities to scribble in my notebook, to talk to other writers on the phone, or like right now, I'll talk with you, Jim. I know we go back and forth on writing recently on foreign affairs and foreign policy. That's what gives me energy. And so I even as I practice law and commit myself to a legal career, I will not lose this part of myself that's seeking out stories and writing and critical thinking and trying to share it with people and get feedback in their thoughts and keep the energy moving, keep the writing happening. That sums it up, I think, for me.
Oh, that's fantastic. Do you actually use a notebook? You mentioned notebooks, like old school.
I have them. I have them everywhere. I have like tiny notebooks that fit into pockets and they have little scratches. I have, a big moleskin I got for Christmas that's precious and like only really high quality thoughts or observations can go into that. Really high quality, like anecdotes about artists I admire or writers that I cling to through the years. I put those in that notebook. Quotations go into that notebook. I mean, if I'm jotting something on a legal pad for work, say, and I see something or hear something, I'm liable to kind of get lost in my own scribbles onto the notebook. And it's funny because your kids, they watch you do this. And my son for his birthday, really wanted a black notebook. He's 8. And so my sister gave him this black notebook, and he starts recording his thoughts and what happened in his day. And my sister showed it to me, he's watching, he's watching. And now my wife's going to have to deal with more scrap pieces of paper all over our house and mess that we're making by saving these meaningless pieces of, thought or writing.
Oh, I love that. I mean, that's real writing. Also a devotee of the notebook, and I've always loved that Tolkien came up with the first line of The Hobbit while grading papers and just kind of wrote it on the back of a student paper. I mean, can you imagine?
I never knew that. I never knew that.
Yeah, no, yeah. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit, and but he was grading papers and he just wrote it on the back of a blue book. I mean, can you imagine if you're the student and you had that blue book? That'd be
Yeah,
fantastic. What
it
an
would be.
art.
Yeah, it would be fantastic. It is weird how you mention as he's grading papers. It's weird how you go when you are in the regimented thinking of your job. You know, you had a day job, I have a day job, you have a day job. When you're in the regimented thinking of your job, it's weird how these other thoughts will release themselves and they'll come to you when you're doing your more like logical, literal process. And I don't know, I feel like if I didn't have a regimented day job, I'd lose that sort of tension between where my mind wants to go and where it has to go. That kind of like gives the spring energy to create. I totally identify with that. I hope to.
Oh yeah. Um, what area of law do you practice?
Corporate law, like business law, working on agreements between companies. I previously had litigated cases at a law firm where I started and where I started this novel. I was in Nebraska representing mostly like insurance companies defending the insured person in car accident cases and driving around in Iowa and Nebraska to go and take depositions and appear in courthouses and it was a good experience, especially to hear people talk. Like if I have this thing where I love to listen to people talk, and I love to take an interview and just transcribe. I won't even use like a software to transcribe someone speaking. I have to like type it out. And when I was at this law firm, I was taking depositions for people, and I was also reading and transcribing and summarizing depositions as a very junior lawyer. And you really get into the speech patterns of people. And then your mind starts to wonder what they're thinking behind what they're saying. And I found that to be really, fruitful and creative. I'm starting to sound like all I do is like imagine my own things. But in addition to doing what I was supposed to do, I was having like very fruitful thoughts. And it kind of like the vocation feeds the avocation in a sense.
You also served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security at the end of the first Trump term. How was that experience?
Sort of transformational in my life at that point. I was friends with a Marine named David Richardson, a fantastic painter and novelist. And we had worked together in Afghanistan when I was a lieutenant and he was a lieutenant colonel. And I had seen this Marine who was a part of our unit, and he was a little bit different. He dressed a little different, talked a little different. And he made me curious about what he was, where he came from. And I remember I looked him up one day and I found that he had an art show in Georgetown after he came back from a deployment, and it was covered by the New York Times. And I was really not just struck by the fact that this man was a Marine and he was also an artist and accomplished at that, but I was really taken by his pictures, by his color, by the abstraction. And I knew of art, but I had not been a visual art person at that time. And so I became very interested in this Marine and his experiences, his art practice, and his paintings were based on war. They were based not just on the stories of war. For him, it was the Trojan War and the Iliad. He had taught those at university in between deployments, but also his encounter with war in Iraq and Ramadi in a book that he wrote about that called War Story. It came out, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. And so we struck up a friendship around these things. And in 2020, he was taking an appointment at Department of Homeland Security and asked if I would come and work for him. And I left what I was doing at the law firm and I left my home in Nebraska, and I went and embarked on this with the Assistant Secretary Richardson and for the president. And it was a very motivating experience to work for the president, to work for something that I believed in someone I believed in and believe in still. And it sort of like gave me, I don't know, it gave me an extra sort of propulsion in life when I came back to Nebraska in 2021, after President Trump left office the first time. And it's been something that I have that's special to me in the years since.
Were you at all frustrated in working in government? I mean, I found it to be a highly rewarding thing, and yet also at times, you can understand what Doge is all about.
Certainly, it was very frustrating to come, I think, especially from Nebraska, where there really are no free lunches in my state. It is an efficient state. There is, I think, the lowest unemployment rate in the country, one of the lowest unemployment rates recorded by a state, I think, in the history of these statistics. And everybody is performing in this state, as anecdotally, but from my observation, people are a teacher or a cop or a doctor or you get the idea. And to return to DC, a place I had experienced as a midshipman at the academy and as a young Marine, and see it with these kind of like refreshed eyes of like all the abundance of copy machines and the abundance of office supplies and the abundance of workers, personnel, and to wonder where it all comes from and what it all does. And to remind people that some taxpayer in Odo County, Nebraska is funding this. And have we lost touch with the fact that this doesn't just sort of come from nowhere? So yes, it was eye-opening, frustrating to deal with that at the time. And I mean, we're seeing it change now in politics and in government.
Well, I certainly hope so. So, as you have alluded, you were a Marine, Naval Academy graduate, combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. What drew you to service?
My dad, I'd start with. My dad grew up in New York, came to Nebraska to play football at a small school where he met my mom, who was a farm kid in southeast Nebraska along the Missouri River, going back 4 generations at that time. And her family, my mother's family, had not served. They farmed. And my grandfather would always say during World War II that somebody had to stay and work the fields. Somebody had to grow the crop. And that was their tradition, German American farming tradition. My dad's family had served. And they were Irish Americans from Brooklyn and Long Island, and they enlisted. My grandfather had been a enlisted sailor on a destroyer in the Pacific in World War II, and he brought that patriotism home after the war, and his friends were veterans, and his neighborhood was veterans, and they marched in the 4th of July parade, and they flew the flag, and my dad's family flew the flag. And Dad had this admiration, this total admiration for West Point, of all places. And so I was born, and he said he's going to West Point. And I was a kid, and I was wearing a West Point sweatshirt. And my sister graduates from high school, and she wants to go to West Point. And then she takes a visit, and she's like, I'll go to Rice instead. But my time comes, and it was clearly like these things were in my head. And a lot of kids in Nebraska just are not raised to be familiar with the academies or, the military beyond the Air Force, which has a big presence in my home state. And so these things were on my mind, and they combined with September 11th when I was a high school freshman and at a Jesuit school, Catholic school here in Nebraska. And I had a priest who was very much about the sacrifice that it takes to serve a mission greater than yourself. And he encouraged military service, Father O'Leary. And so these things kind of started to come together for me at 15 and 16 years old, where I felt a call to do something and to test myself in a selfish way, to test myself and see who I was, who am I, to reveal my character in action. Like I think many young men who want to go to war feel called to do. And I graduated high school and I did not enlist. I could have enlisted in 2005, which was in the height of the Iraq War. It would have been 6 months after the Second Battle of Fallujah. If I had enlisted in the Marine Corps, no doubt I would have been in Ramadi or Fallujah. It would have been somewhere in Anbar probably by the end of the year. And many of my generational peers did that. And that to me is like just something of complete admiration. I didn't do that. I went to the Naval Academy. I played tennis. I had a wonderful experience for 4 years, and then I graduated in 2009 and committed myself and commissioned into the Marine Corps.
How long did you serve?
6 years in total, commissioned in 2009 and separated from the service in January of 2015. So it's not 10 years ago now. It doesn't feel so long ago. And I had a good experience.
I saw in another interview that the question of where you served needs to be clarified with who were you with and when were you there? So let me ask you all that.
I served in Helmand in 2011 and 2012. I was a ground intelligence officer, and when I got to Camp Lejeune, there were too many of those for the infantry battalions. And so there were 5 or 6 of us who were sent to the division staff and the intelligence staff, the G2. And we deployed in February of 11 to Helmand province. And we worked on this staff, and we did targeting intelligence, and we did all source analysis, collections, management, geospatial. And we would sometimes go out to patrol bases, but that's not where I ended up serving on that deployment. I served with the staff and targeting intelligence and all source analysis and working primarily for a general, an infantry general. And that lasted for a year. And then I came back and I got the opportunity to go to an infantry battalion and become a scout sniper platoon commander at 1st Battalion, 6th Marines. And I was there until I promoted to captain, and then I became the battalion intel officer, and we deployed in 2014 on a Marine Expeditionary Unit floating through the Mediterranean, up and down to the Suez Canal. I know, Jim, we were talking about a great article written by Ashton Earl on a Gaza canal.
Yeah, the Gaza Canal idea.
Mm-hmm. And I remember the congestion Ashton references in the Suez Canal, transiting up and down to be on call at hot spots outside of Libya or outside of Jordan, outside of Iraq. And eventually we deployed to Baghdad. A company-sized group of us went to Baghdad in 2014 when the Islamic State had reemerged in Mosul and further into southern parts of Iraq. And I was at the embassy for, I don't know, a month and a half or so with the infantry battalion. And then we came home after a 9-month tour. And that was 2014. So I think it's important to the record, the historical record, when people talk about what they did, they speak about who they were with and when they were there.
When you were in Afghanistan, did you work closely with the Afghan government forces?
We did. The government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, JIROA, in our abbreviations and all of our intel products, and the Afghan National Security Forces, ANSIF, and the Afghan Local Police, the ALP, the Afghan National Army, ANA, the Afghan National Police, the ANP. And we were training all of these Afghan forces, advising the Afghan government and trying to help them stand up on their feet. And it was a very illuminating project. It was a very discouraging project at times, but I felt committed to it, and I felt the people I served with were committed to it and believed it could be done, it would be done. Though in our heads, maybe we didn't think about how long it would take.
Yeah, sorry. My dissertation topic was the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, and a little different than the U.S. experience, but you get that same sense of frustration. They kept changing their strategy, trying to find something that worked. Of course, they figured out after 10 years that they weren't going to make it work. It took us 20 years to leave, but uh, and of course, they did things that we would never do in terms of pursuing their strategy, which was a little bit different, or a lot different, actually. But it's interesting to compare the American experience and the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, even the British experience in Afghanistan. It's its own place. It always will be.
It is its own place. And I remember one occasion, if you remember the base structure in Helmand, the Marine Corps built Camp Leatherneck. Next to it was Camp Bastion, which was the British base, had been there, years, I assume, before our base. And it was built up, and they had a wonderful cafeteria, little coffee shops, and a pizza place. And they had nice little trailers where the British soldiers lived. I remember seeing little rugs laid out at the doorstep, an antenna with satellites. They have certain creature comforts in order to the way that they were expeditionary, that U.S. Marines are not quite so tuned to. And then next to that base was Camp Shorabak, which was the home of the Afghan National Army unit that we were training. And on one occasion, we drove from our base into the Camp Shorabak, the Afghan base, to do an interaction with their intelligence equivalent. And they took us into a big command operations center that we had funded and built for them. And it looked much like ours, an amphitheater style setup with projectors, and they had computers. And the lieutenant colonel in the Afghan National Army had a young analyst with him, and he snapped his fingers and told the analyst to start doing intelligence. And the analyst sat down at the computer and started typing things into the computer. And he said, see, he's doing intelligence. He's typing reporting into the computer, just like you. And I looked at his computer, and there was a power cord plugged into the wall, but that was it. There was no internet, no network. And I said, like, where is the intelligence going? And he looked at me like, it's going, and through the translator, Ahmad said, it's going into the computer. And I said, yes, but where does it go after that? If you don't share intelligence, what purpose does it serve? And he just sort of shook his head like, I didn't get it. It goes into the computer. What more do you want? And at the time, maybe I'm thinking, boy, these guys just don't get it. But I look back and I think, he had seen so many different, perhaps, episodes of people coming in and telling him what to do and how to do it. And he was demonstrating like, hey, we know how to act. We know how to imitate what you guys do. Like, this is what you want, right? You want to see us doing this. That was the point, perhaps, to him, having been through this before. But I was 24 and thought if only we could get them to share the intel, then we can start making progress.
Now, you wrote a book based on your experiences, a novel entitled River City One. What can you tell us about your book?
I wrote it in my spare time. I wrote it late at night. I wrote it from a sense that I couldn't explain things to people around me about what I had lost in the experience being over, in the war being over, in the military being over. And so it happened for me at a moment where everything came together. I was talking to a woman at a party, and we were having a conversation, and it was an interesting conversation. And she posed the question, does a soldier come home from war? And it came to me at a time when I was feeling like I hadn't come home from war. that I wasn't getting over the experience of the Marine Corps. I missed the Marine Corps. I missed the Marines. I missed the mission. And I didn't really like what I was doing. Civilian life seemed frivolous to me at the time. And her question just struck me in such a way that I started really, really thinking and stewing on it in my office and at home. And then I start reading, articles to try to answer this question. And I'm looking into the fiction of other veterans of the post 9/11 wars and seeing if they've dealt with this question. And A Quiet Cadence was a book by a guy named Mark Trainer that came out from the Naval Institute Press a few years ago. And he was a Vietnam veteran who wrote his novel about kind of coming home from war, but he wrote it like 40 years after he came home from war. And that was the only one I really could find in recent memory of someone writing a post-war novel, not a war novel, but something about after. And so a combination of the emotion in me and the opportunity to do something writing-wise that I felt I could do that maybe hadn't been explicitly done gave me the courage to start working. And that set me off on River City 1.
Why did you choose fiction as opposed to memoir, autobiography? What did fiction give you that just a recitation of events wouldn't give you?
You have to lie to tell the truth. Picasso said that. And I felt I needed to lie because I didn't experience everything that comes in the book. I didn't watch someone step on an IED. I didn't go through the things that this character is put through in the story. But I had observed some of these things. I had been in contact emotionally with Marines who had done and seen these things. And the story that comes to mind was when I became a scout sniper platoon commander at 1-6. And the Marines I interacted with had been through these things. And I had total respect and admiration, maybe too much, for what they had gone through, what they had done, and I hadn't as an officer, as someone who waited 4 years to get into the war, to get into the Marine Corps and get into the war. And one day I remember there was a Marine who was in the office who I hadn't known, and he had a Marine high and tight haircut. He hadn't shaved. He was wearing a T-shirt and cargo shorts, and his legs were amputated above the knee. And I had heard about this Marine from others in the platoon. He had been with them on the previous deployment to Sangin, Afghanistan. And when I talk about where were you and who were you with, a place like Sangin should really stick in the American consciousness, especially 2009, 10, 11, 12. This place was as bad as anything. The name should ring like Marja and like Ramadi and like Fallujah at certain points in time. And they had been on a patrol, the sniper platoon, during that deployment. And this Marine had stepped on an IED. And there were things that it wasn't just that event that the Marines brought back with them, the trauma and what they saw that happened to their friend, but it was something about how they reacted or didn't react after it happened. How they had been trained to clear a path to the wounded man, use their tourniquets to stanch the loss of blood, call a medevac. All those things you're trained to do very instinctively, but when you're alone in your rack at night, you wonder if you'll do them. I think of Henry Fleming as the character from The Red Badge of Courage. There's a scene where he's lying in his bed before he goes into battle in the Civil War, and he's thinking about how he'll react under fire, and he's forced to admit that he knows nothing of himself, really. He won't know until it happens. And so the Marines, they saved their other Marine's life, though he lost both of his legs. They saved his life, but there was something they weren't really telling me about what happened between the time the IED detonated and the time he was evac'd. that maybe people hadn't reacted the way that they had wanted to react. And I never went through that myself, so I can't answer it. And I don't judge. I have no judgment of them. But that sort of tension about what I knew and what I couldn't know and what people couldn't tell me was a part of why fiction became a vehicle to explore the truth. And I try to get to that in the story.
Of course, there's a great tradition of this. When you look at Tim O'Brien, Joseph Heller, maybe Ambrose Bierce, going back to the Civil War, of people who have used fiction as just a way of expressing the things they've seen. I mean, you say you have to lie to tell the truth, but there's a truth in that statement for sure. Things maybe you didn't experience, but you heard about or you saw, or things that reach a deeper truth that you're trying to explore. As you say, when you're alone at night thinking about what you might do or not do. There's a friend of IWP, Philip Jennings, who was a Marine helicopter pilot in Vietnam, who wrote several books, but one in particular called Namarama, which deals with his experiences, again, set fictionally and almost satirically, to try to capture the absurdity of some of his experiences. And Phil, well, just thinking about Phil, but he had a similar experience of coming back and thinking that, people just didn't understand. Like they didn't know his experience and he could not relate to people. He came back to Southern California to people who just didn't know anything about the Vietnam War or his experiences. And he just couldn't take it. I mean, he went back. He volunteered for Air America and went to Laos, flying for them. But again, it was because he just couldn't deal with being back in the world. So is that part of what you were trying to convey in your book?
Yes. And his story sounds fascinating. I'll have to go and look it up now that you mention it. I think of that scene in The Hurt Locker where Jeremy Renner's character, an IED or a counter IED technician, an EOD technician in the Army, is back from a deployment and he's in the aisle of the grocery store staring at the infinite varieties of cereal. And it's like, I don't know if the very next scene it cuts to him going back to Iraq, but it's like one of these things is incomprehensible to the rational, educated American civilian mind, but it becomes somehow understandable and relatable when you go through these experiences. Somehow we go from people who live ordinary family lives in Nebraska or in DC or anywhere, and step by logical step, you find yourself at the front of this incredible and destructive experience in war. And you can't really say why you got there or how you got there, but you're there, and then you're never the same. And your point about authors through history dealing with these inexplicable things through fiction, Ambrose Bierce is a favorite. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge captivated me as a kid on a car trip, listening to it on audio. He was using surreal elements, magic, mystery, to try to mediate for the audience the experience that they couldn't just, get literally through nonfiction, through the facts. And he didn't like Stephen Crane. He didn't like The Red Badge of Courage, though it was like a phenomenon when it came out, because Crane was a kid who was born 6 years or so after the end of the war.
Right.
He was not a veteran. Yeah. He was a scrawny, 22-year-old guy who had probably grown up hearing the stories and the mysteries sort of fermented inside his imagination, and he had to deal with it. And in a 200-page shot, he just captured something about a young boy's like encounter with mortality and the fear of combat and like coming to know who you are. And also through this impressionistic writing way, managed to find the emotional truth of experiencing battle. And Bierce had been a Civil War veteran himself. It probably, I don't know, but probably it was kind of like, this kid doesn't speak for us. How's he? He's never experienced combat. How can he understand it? I think later Crane found some type of combat experience as a journalist. He died young, but how can fiction do that? How can someone who never experienced it get at it? And that's the issue. You want to reach for the reader who doesn't experience these things. You want to give him or her the feeling of what it's like.
So beyond your novel and its themes, when we look at the legacy of Iraq, Afghanistan, I mean, all people talk about now is the Afghanistan pullout fiasco and how terrible that was and how mismanaged. And I mean, we could do a whole separate show on that. But I mean, there's a lot of history and experience in those wars, beyond that utter failure at the end in Afghan. So how is that affecting things now, or is it affecting things? Have people kind of forgotten about it?
I think it's front and center. And I think what we are witnessing happening through, you mentioned the Department of Government efficiency. Some would say the attack on our institutions. Whatever you call it, we're seeing a new perspective on what government can and cannot do. And to me, it comes as no surprise that people like Tulsi Gabbard, 43, Director of National Intelligence, was an officer in the U.S. Army who experienced the war on terror. Pete Hegseth, 44, an officer in the Army who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Lee Zeldin, 44, EPA Administrator, an Army officer, former Army officer. Kash Patel did not serve in the uniformed services, but was a terrorism prosecutor. And of course, J.D. Vance, enlisted Marine, which I think can't be overemphasized how interesting and unusual that is to his perspective, that he did not just serve, he was not just a Marine, but he enlisted in the Marine Corps. All of these veterans, in my opinion, have seen the limits of what government can and cannot do. All of these people understand viscerally and personally when chaos happens. Despite our best intentions and how our best intentions become corrupted over time, the political aim of the war in Afghanistan was to create the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, unseat the Taliban, and create a new security force and create a democratic country. Somehow we failed. Somehow we not only just failed, we sort of gave up. We decided on an anniversary date that it just wasn't worth us. So we abandoned the country. We left $7 billion in weapons. We left Americans behind. We left allies and friends behind and just called it quits. How does that happen? I mean, that's like incomprehensible to those of us who took part in the mission and believed it could be achieved. And at some point, it was not the country telling us to do this. It was the government. And this new generation of leadership has a total constructive pessimism about what government can achieve, I think, and they're trying to do something about it. And I think this in some ways is the consequences, or one of the consequences, of the failure of the war on terror.
I just want to point out it's not the first time that we abandoned our allies. I mean, it's been done before. You can talk to South Vietnamese or Cambodians that we abandoned. I don't think the United States has a perfect track record by any means in terms of backing up our people. It's kind of shameful how the United States invests so much and then turns on a dime for geopolitical or even domestic political reasons and hangs these people out to dry. I mean, to me, it's shameful. And my wife, who's an Iraq veteran, and also was in Afghanistan, looks at this as a great, terrible moment. And particularly for not just for the people there that we abandoned, but for the people who served, like yourself, who put their heart and soul into these projects. Some people never came back. One of my students died in Afghanistan. And then for what? For what? Look at it now. The Taliban is back. They're recreating their totalitarian theocracy, undoing absolutely everything that we did. What a waste. And people, I think you're right I hadn't seen it laid out like that, of all of the new government officials of a similar age group who had experience in these things and the perspective that they bring. I think you're right. It's a very sobering thing, and it will lead to a much more realistic approach to what the government can do.
That's a great point. I think when you're in DC, and there are a lot of idealistic people in DC, I don't want to discount that. A lot of young people who go to the Institute of World Politics to study and make the world a better place, who want to take part in helping and in serving and in drafting policy about what ought to be, how much better things ought to be. And that's one part of the equation. But for every one of those people that I'm talking about, at some point they signed their last will and testament in their early 20s. They walked into some gymnasium or some officers club or whatever, and in a long line, they processed up to the desk and they signed saying who would get their stuff. And so they had to contemplate death at an early age in their 20s. Like, it became real that life is fragile. And at some point, they probably watched friends die that they didn't expect, and it probably bothered them. But anyway, you contemplate what you are preparing to die for. And you come home and you see, people who are not willing to risk things, or they seem neurotically clutching things for fear of losing, and it can frustrate you. It can upset you. I think all of these new political leaders, new leaders in government have served an apprenticeship to service and its consequences, and they just want to reset things to reality. And I think they're doing a good thing for the country in doing so.
Do you ever see like videos coming out of Ukraine or Gaza, let's say the fighting conditions over there, particularly Ukraine, where there's some very good drone video of just how terrible it is? And just on a human level, when you see these folks out there just grinding in this trench warfare that's going nowhere, just, people have been mobilized fighting in a war they don't want. Particularly these Russians who were, pulled out of prisons or, drafted, or, North Koreans who don't have no clue what's going on. I mean, just on a human level, do you look at this and say that just it's so tragic to see these people dying in droves for nothing?
Yes, I think but I think about myself and like, how do I accept this? And how do we accept this? And when President Trump says this is a tragedy and millions of people have died, and you should have sought a deal, or you should have resolved this, or we need to resolve this. It's the return of truth and reality that we can't. We just don't accept that this happens. And at some point, we live in this time in history where it's like impossible for us to agree on just basic things like, what is a man, what is a woman, what is the point of war? At some point, the point of war just became to just have it, just to continue to do war, not to win it, not to resolve it. And so, to your point, when you see these images and footage of these things, I just think of families. I think of separation. I think of loss. And I think of irreparable damage done to families. And that is hard to stomach, and someone needs to find a way to resolve it.
Oh, yeah. No, it's terrible. I mean, you have a leader like Putin who couldn't care less. He would kill as many people as it takes to pursue his dream of a greater Russia. And as the mechanism to do it, send all these people into this meat grinder. It's like watching World War One. Just senseless attacks leading to nothing, and just people dying.
It's brutal. It's incomprehensible to us living in safety and security, and it's hard to watch. It's hard to just be a spectator and have an opinion because it's almost too serious to just sort of cast opinions upon. Yeah.
Would you ever see yourself returning to government? Do you want to do something like that?
Yes. Yes. Public service is a part of what inspires me and what I would seek to do in the future. Yes.
Yeah, you networking that? You working on it?
Yeah. I'll keep up with everyone I served with in the administration and people who share my interest in public service and in a way you never finish the mission you started as a 18-year-old or a 22-year-old Marine, and you're called to return and continue to serve your country. That's true for everyone I served with. I feel it's definitely true for me. And you balance that with obligations to your family and your neighborhood and your community. But yes, I would return.
Well, that's good. Well, we need good people more than ever these days, especially. So, well, John, thanks for coming on the show. Our guest today has been John J. Waters, sharing with us his experiences, author of the novel River City 1. John, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robbins. It's a pleasure.
Well, that's it. For more information about IWP, for our programs or degree offerings, please consult our website at iwp.edu. Once again, I'm Jim Robbins. Tune in next time for another edition of the IWP podcast.
If you like our podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe. And if you are interested in learning more about the topics we covered here today and want to be a student at IWP, go to iwp.edu and click Apply now.